So now I want to introduce our next speaker, who many of you already know, probably all of you do, as the founder of Rainforest Action Network. He also still remains on the board of Rainforest Action and currently works in Washington, D.C. with Andrew Kimbrell, who will speak after him, at the Earth Foundation, which is a new think tank developing a big picture for human order, which includes economic models, legal governance systems, educational programs, and healthcare systems. He calls this for a reinvention of the role of human society on Earth. Randy served for 5 years as president of the City of San Francisco's Commission on the Environment, and for 2 years as director of sustainability in the office of Oakland Mayor Jerry Brown before he was governor again. He has a master's degree in environmental planning from San Francisco State University, and he has received numerous awards, including some from the Business Ethics Network and Alumnus of the Year 2010 at San Francisco State University. He's one of the great activists of our time, so please welcome Randy Hayes.
Hi, everybody. Listening to all of the speakers yesterday and this morning, one can't sort of help but feeling that there's this horrendous storm bearing down on us, right? But that's only half the story. One can also feel, right, that there's no time left for anything except maybe big steps towards a big positive vision, right? And lots of that's emerging at this conference as well. Well, that big positive vision, for me, a lot of that is about relating to the Earth in a different way, and of course relating to each other in a different way. And even though the hour feels late, it's really conferences like this that help us add clarity to that big positive vision, right? And specifics around steps that we can take. But they also help us kind of get together to recharge the batteries, as they say, right? To amass that kind of courage. And we need mountain chains worth of courage to make the shift that's necessary to get society in sync with nature's ways, and of course in sync with each other. And that's the Great U-turn, right? Somebody who knew something about U-turns and knew something about nature's ways was David Brower. And David Brower, the great mountaineer and climber, a fine naturalist and a really powerful activist, spoke in this very chamber many different times. He might have even told the story that I'm about to tell, because David often liked to teach through stories. And one of his story was, if there's a horrendous storm bearing down on you, if you're standing on the edge of a cliff, right, and there's cataclysmic consequences from falling off the edge, sometimes the solution is relatively simple. Just turn around and go a fundamentally different direction, right? That was his way of introducing the concept of the great ecological U-turn, which society so well needs. And David also would talk a lot in his, just before he died, about economics and the economics of sustainability. And he essentially boiled it down to probably the most important environmental policy is economic policy. And we have got to get the economics of sustainability down, or we are not going to solve these environmental problems, right? And part of getting that economic model right, though, I've been thinking, subsequent to good old David passing on, has a lot to do with technology and technology policy itself. And I wanted to read a quote that some of you have heard me read before, from Jared Diamond, who wrote Collapse, right? Guns, Germs, and Steel, and all those things. And this is what Jared Diamond had to say about technology. All of our current environmental problems, not some of them, all of them, are unanticipated harmful consequences of our existing technology. And there is no basis for believing that technology will miraculously stop causing new and unanticipated problems while it's trying to solve the problems that it previously produced. Right? Now, I bring that up for a couple of reasons, but one being that we heard a lot at this conference so far, and just it's in the milieu of the times about climate change and the problem of climate change and the need to solve the problem of climate change. I want you to just think for a second about what is climate change really, right? Climate change can also be thought of as the symptom of another more deeper problem. And when you understand that deeper problem, it might lead you to more authentic solutions. Because if we just simply replace fossil fuel energies with renewable energies, we may buy some time, but I don't think we will solve our problems. If you go back to the late 1700s, what was most of the energy that people used at that time, right? It was the the daily solar income was really the bulk of the energy. And we didn't waste a lot of energy. We burned some wood, in some places lots of wood, right? But what happened in the late 1800s is we started using coal, and we started using it for steam and steam machines and the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and then came oil and gas, right? And those energy technology choices that we made from the late 1700s and in the 1800s seemed like a really good idea at the time, didn't they? I mean, who would have anticipated that it might shred the very fabric of the web of life on planet Earth? That it might lead to the demise of most of the species on the Earth. These are unanticipated consequences. Climate change is not a problem as much as it is the symptom of the problem of the lack of a technology policy. So that being said, what kind of technology policy? I've actually just started a bit of research in Washington, D.C. on what is the technology policy for various countries around the world, and what is it for the United States. It's not easy to sort out, but it leads me to think that we're going to have to write it ourselves. So I'm hoping there's somebody in the audience today who can draft the Unanticipated Consequences Act of 2015, right? And where we would register new technologies, evaluate them, perhaps a 5-year sort of assessment report, looking to see and trying to amass early on what are the unanticipated consequences of these new technologies. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue technological innovation. A speaker in Aspen, Colorado, recently at a renewable energy conference was talking about not cold fusion or hot fusion, but this hybrid fusion in between that he so thought would be the silver bullet to solve our energy problems. Well, what are the unanticipated consequences of that? Maybe none, and maybe quite a few, right? So do we have any volunteers out there to draft the Unanticipated Consequences Act of 2015? That would be wonderful if you did. Another person that I met that I've learned a lot from, I met actually here in San Francisco, though he's a Brit from Cambridge, a man named Yorick Blumenfeld. His son lived here in town and was the head of the Department of the Environment, and now is the head of the local EPA region. But Papa Yorick wrote a book called Dollars or Democracy that I think has a lot to offer in terms of the theme of this conference. And Yorick, though he's from Cambridge, he's not an academic. He actually was the head of, I believe it was Newsweek's European Bureau of Newsweek during the Soviet Union. And he covered the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet countries. And he was no fan of communism or the economies over there. But it turned out he was less of a fan of capitalism. And he wrote this book, Dollars or Democracy, and here's a quote from it. "Fortunately, capitalism is not an iron law of history. It is an economic and political system which arose out of the decaying feudal structure in the 18th century and was advanced by the haves over the have-nots." And Yorick argues in this book that what he calls American capitalism is fundamentally unreformable. You can decide for yourself, but I'll give you his 10 primary reasons. Capitalism erodes and corrupts democracy, right? It's fundamentally undemocratic, controlling virtually all political parties. Capitalism is bottom-feeding in that it pits countries and states and counties against each other, right? Seeking the lowest level of cheap labor and the least regulations. It drives off accountability. Corporate managers and shareholders are protected from personal liabilities. Capitalism's values are insufficient for some of the things that we quite value. It doesn't do much to control things like child labor. It doesn't help the poor from the standpoint of there's at least 3 billion people around the world who are underserved by that model. Capitalism has a stability problem and an debt accumulation problem, and it's highly subsidized. And globalized capitalism undercuts the local economies, including places like Richmond that we just heard about. It also undercuts diversity, cultural diversity, by fostering homogenization. And it destroys the nature's life support systems, right? So these are some of the dire problems of capitalism. Well, he also goes on to list 22 aspects of an alternative economy that he calls the incentive economy, which I won't go into today. But I will go into some of what we at Foundation Earth think are some of the guiding principles for a holistic, more true cost economy. Right, so if all of those different problems that I articulated is the great cheater economics, that's my shorthand for the economy that we have, is a form of cheater economics. It not only doesn't internalize the pollution externalities or deal with the carrying capacity issues of the biosphere, but it does all of those other deleterious things. So, how reformable is it or not? To me, in part, I don't care. I do think we've got to buy some time. We can seek some fundamental reforms to it to buy time, and that might be desperately needed in terms of this going from 2 degrees centigrade average temperature rise to 3 or 4 or even higher that is quite scary. So here are about 12 principles that I'll just touch upon for a more holistic or true cost economy. It starts in our mind with an interdependence principle, that societal recognition is that nature nourishes all things, and that's a far higher value than that of human self-interest, Another one is the responsibility principle, that each generation is responsible to leave less and less of an ecological footprint. And that's despite whatever our population numbers are, or our consumption rates, or our technology choices. You have to amass the 3 of those together to get that holistic picture, right? And every human has a duty to protect the diversity within the whole. That should be the responsibility, part of the responsibility principle. And then there are other things like the carrying capacity principle. Free markets are not free from ecological limits. Right, the true cost principle, where pollution externalities are internalized into the price that you pay for goods. And when one does that, the ecologically cleanest becomes the cheapest financially. Organic tomatoes ought to be cheaper financially than toxic tomatoes if you had a more true cost pricing. Organic cotton would be cheaper than toxic cotton in a system of a true cost economy. And non-commodification of nature, a principle around that. It's just rather unholy to commodify every aspect of nature through ecosystem service markets and that whole approach. If you take it to its absurdity, people would start charging you to breathe clean air. Not okay with me. The precautionary principle specifically around technology, right? Where if consequences are potentially cataclysmic in the David Brower story, right? When in doubt, play it safe and put the burden of proof on those perpetrating that new technology. So the precautionary principle. Compassionate local self-reliance principle. This one's very important to me. I think that we ought to be thinking in terms of bioregional economies and networks of bioregional economies throughout any given continent, right? And that the primary things that we would trade globally would be art, culture, and ideas, and not the physical stuff, that we become that. But it's a compassionate self-reliance where your bioregion would be there also to help the neighbor, even if the neighbor's on the other side of the planet, right? And a big part of what might be called foreign aid policy would be about helping other regions around the world to become more self-reliant, and not just the things of food, clothing, and shelter, the primary needs, but also the comfort items of life that help you have a dignified kind of life. The closed loop principle is fundamentally important. It gets talked about a little bit these days, even in Davos, as the circular economy, right? But each economy needs to be essentially zero waste, closed loop, sustainable production and consumption systems. And that's a principle on which to have a holistic true cost economy. And the last one I'll mention is the feedback principle, that we know from science that every living system needs to have feedback loops to be self-correcting, right? And humanity and our economy needs to have that. Talking about, of course, feedback loops like, the happiness index or the genuine progress indicator. But a very important, particularly important feedback loop has to do with the ecological impacts on the planet, and especially the planet's larger cycles, the great cycles of the planet, what we might call the biosphere's life support systems, right? So that holistic economy and that feedback principle, with that, it helps to get more specific around some of these kinds of things. So at Foundation Earth, we've worked really hard to refine this idea, and we've produced this sort of 90-page, highly dense but wonderfully written piece called the Mandatory Corporate Ecological Impact Disclosure, right? A working paper. And mandatory corporate ecological impact disclosure is pretty much what we're talking about. It's the kind of thing where these voluntary codes of conduct, even at Rainforest Action Network, when we stopped Burger King from buying rainforest beef, so many years later, they start buying it again. You stop Home Depot from selling old-growth wood on their shelves. If you aren't monitoring it, it slips between the cracks, right? So it's important, I think, that we recognize that voluntary codes of conduct have not created the great ecological U-turn. It's also, I think, important to, from time to time, ask, what are the problems that we're trying to fix, and help us sort of refine the clarity of our vision and our work. And with the problem with this particular paper as a feedback system, the problem we're trying to fix is that corporate sustainability reports are greenwashing, bullshit, horseshit documents that are not worth the good paper that they are printed on, right? I mean, there's over 4,000 corporate sustainability reports now written under the Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI framework, right? And while we're glad it's there, it's better than nothing, but not by very much, to be honest, right? And these are my friends that put it together, but it's just not getting the job done, and we've got to get the job done, right? So even if you look at the best GRI report, it's from the company Puma, where they actually at least put a laundry list of the pollution externalities that are not internalized into the price for their tennis shoes or whatever the hell they're trying to sell you, right? So good for them for at least acknowledging what they don't do in terms of reporting, right? So this following idea on our mandatory corporate disclosure is the kind of thing that could be administered through the Security Exchange Commission, and we're looking at specifically pushing that angle. So there's a lot of specificity to it. There isn't time to go into it today, but I will just simply say that foundational to any new economy that claims to be better, right, has got to be excellent transparency, and especially transparency in terms of the biosphere's life support systems, these great cycles of nature. And if you're not very familiar with the life support systems of the biosphere, right, there's a new scientific framework that puts them into 9 different categories. Things like the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, and the hydrologic freshwater cycle, and ocean acidification, and climate change and biodiversity, and things like that you'll easily know and understand. But what we have written up in this paper is that every corporation, including their entire supply chain, would have to report in a data sense, not in a greenwashing spin sense, just the raw data on what their ecological impacts are, and to put that data into these 9 buckets of the biosphere's life support system. So if you could imagine an industrial agriculture company like Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland or something, right? The industrial agriculture, one of the pollution externalities is all the nitrogen runoff, right? It's hideous. It is driving the nitrogen cycle of the planet off the charts. We need nitrogen to exist in a cyclic fashion, but there's a safe operating zone. There's a certain amount of nitrogen that we need in the biosphere, and not all of this human-produced nitrogen, right? It's what runs off the agricultural fields down the Mississippi into the Gulf that creates the dead zone. There are over 400 dead zones off of rivers from industrial agriculture, right? That's just a tangible example of these kinds of pollution externalities. So the data would have to be put into that framework. The data would have to be independently audited, just like a financial audit has third-party CPAs, certified public auditors, right? We would have certified ecological auditors because we don't trust the corporations to do it honestly. They have no record of it. And this data would be publicly available to anybody and everybody worldwide, right? We really just simply have to design those kinds of reporting processes into the economic model. And it's not rocket science anymore. These things, they can be done, right? So that's what this particular initiative is about at Foundation Earth. And there was a team of us who put this together. One is Frank Arendal, who's in the room here today. Frank, wave your hand somewhere. People interested can ask him back there in the corner. Neil Glazer's in Philadelphia, who's the lead writer on it, who's a really brilliant thinker about these kinds of things. So another big step in the positive vision, besides ecological impact disclosure, it has to do with industrial agriculture. And true cost, in a true cost economy, we need ways in which, if banks are going to finance giant agricultural loans the way the World Bank finances them on a regular basis, and many other banks do as well, including these days, the emerging sort of banks from Brazil and China and India also. Food and agriculture is going to be of great import in our alternative model, and it's of great import right now in terms of flooding beyond the safety borders of the planetary boundaries, these life support systems of the planet. So a new project at Foundation Earth is that we're looking at agricultural loans from a holistic full cost accounting perspective, and we're doing this at the World Bank. We have we have many misgivings about trying to reform the World Bank, but it's a starting point to play for this. Ultimately, all banks need to be doing this. We need to analyze agricultural loans from a holistic perspective and look at those pollution externalities like the nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, the greenhouse gas emissions, the soil depletion and destruction and erosion and all of that. And if you had a holistic way within the bank to analyze that loan, you would also then need an incentive systems for the bank loan officers to be rewarded and paid more for giving holistic agricultural loans and sustainable agricultural loans as opposed to industrial agricultural loans. So that's the newest project that we have at Foundation Earth. And so that's just all to give you a flavor of some of our thinking about the great ecological U-turn, and from getting from cheater economics to a more true cost economy, and a couple of the specific chunks that we have carved out to work on. The subtitle for Foundation Earth is a big rethink from the ground up. When Andy and Brent Blackwelder and I were setting it up, though, affectionately, a couple of us were using as a tagline for the organization, if we're going to lose, damn it, let's lose big. But I'd rather not lose, right? And so we've launched these specific initiatives, right? And all that said now, let me just pose one question, and that is, are we at the end of the age of capitalism? And with that, I'll now, let Georgia bring up our next speaker, who's smarter and better looking than me and can answer that question. Thank you.